Okay, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. I am your host, David Parsons. I have another great show for you today. Before we get started, I just want to remind you that there are bonus episodes being posted all the time, and there will be more bonus episodes throughout the summer. So if you don't get enough Nostalgia Trap, you can get more at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And for basically the price of like buying me a cup of coffee, you can keep the show going, which is a nice goal. I want to keep doing these. But also, you'll get access to bonus episodes and more conversations and stuff that I don't necessarily want to post to everybody. So if you're looking for that kind of stuff, then check out patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and you can subscribe to the show. Thank you so much for those that are doing that already and those that are enjoying and responding to the bonus episodes. It's really fun to have that community growing and to see that grow, and I hope to do that throughout the summer. We've got some really, really great guests coming up. I don't want to give it away, but I think that the people who listen to this show, people on the left, are going to enjoy the guests that we've got lined up this summer. Some really, really great stuff. So stay tuned to Nostalgia Trap. This summer, I think, is going to be a big time, a big period of growth for the podcast. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. So if you want to be a part of that, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and you can get access to all the crazy episodes we're about to post over the next few months. Okay, so my guest today is Bruce Schulman. Bruce Schulman is awesome. I love his writing. I love his work. I love the way he puts like popular culture and history together, and he does it in a way that is really deep. His analysis is always to me very, very compelling. I first came to his work in graduate school. We talk about it on this in this conversation. This book, The 70s, The Great Shift in American Culture, Politics, and Society by Bruce Schulman, came out in 2001. I consider it like the canonical interpretation of the culture and politics of the 1970s in America. Really, really great stuff. And he does this thing where he kind of like periodizes the 70s as 1968 to 1984. He calls it the long 70s. And we have a conversation about that. I love periodization. It's kind of a history nerd thing, but like the idea that historians can break up time into coherent chunks for us. And I think he does a great job of convincing you that 68 to 84 is one coherent chunk of American history and has a coherent set of values that we can read and a really transformational point too. And I think he's one of the first, historians to get in there with a major interpretation of the 70s, as the 70s now has become more and more a topic for historians to dive into. His is I think something that everybody needs to read. So check out Bruce Schulman's work. Really, really fun stuff. And this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed finally talking with him because his book was something that kind of blew all of our minds when we were in graduate school. I remember all of us in my cohort arguing a lot about the kind of things that he brings up, including his interpretation of disco and Carter and all that kind of stuff. And we get into that in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy that. And again, check out subscribing to the show. You'll get more bonus episodes and all that kind of stuff. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks, as always. I really appreciate it. Enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Bruce Schulman. The reason I wanted to talk to you, there's a million reasons, but your book on the 70s came out right before I started at the CUNY Graduate Center, and it became a part of my orals list, and it was a book that we all passed around and talked about a lot because none of us had really seen a book that kind of took on that decade in that way. There at the time, and there's still. I think the 70s is starting to be rediscovered in a lot of ways. But your book, I feel like, was an early entry on a kind of like a holistic look at the whole decade. Did you feel that when you were writing it or conceiving of it, that there wasn't a lot of 70s stuff out there?
Oh, absolutely. Except for Peter Carroll's book, which had come out almost 20 years before, right at the end of the 70s, there really hadn't been anybody that tried to take the 70s seriously or to look at them whole or to see them as a distinct period that had any kind of influence on reshaping American life. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how for me, I was sort of led to the book in two different ways. And one way, probably the most direct, was just as a teacher. I taught the post-war U.S. history class for years and years, first at UCLA, where I started out, and then at BU. And of course, as you as you move on in that class, more and more stuff was happening, and I felt that I wasn't really, giving enough attention to the post-1968 period. And most of the literature and the textbooks were all, out of 500-page textbook on the post-45 period, you would have something like, 450 pages up to 1968, and then they just cover the rest in a chapter or two.
Mm-hmm.
And so I split the class in half. I created a new class, U.S. since 1968. And when I was writing the lectures and preparing the reading list for that class, there was nothing to go on but primary sources. So I was driven into the primary sources, both for what I assigned to the students to read and for the materials that I wrote the lectures out of. And that's really how I in some ways that was the immediate stimulus for the book. That kind of pushed me into doing it. But of course, the book had been sort of bubbling inside me for a long time because I'm 58 years old. I was born in 1959. I came of age in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I went to high school and college in the 70s. It sort of shaped my perspective. So in some ways, I knew I wanted to write a book about the 70s for years and years and years, but I always thought it was too soon. And sometime in the late 1990s, I had a series of conversations with colleagues and friends and decided it wasn't too soon. It was time to try to write that book.
Yeah. And it really, that makes sense to me that you're talking about it as kind of like one of the ideas behind it was that you wanted something for your teaching, because the book is for the listeners that don't know this book, The 70s, The Great Shift in American Culture, Society and Politics by Bruce Schulman. That book, it's a really great book to use for teaching. It's laid out, it's organized, in a way that makes sense. Now that you're saying that, like, you'd kind of almost design this that way, because I taught the 70s last summer and it was the first time I'd ever taught a course specifically on the 70s, and I used your book, and it just flowed really well, and it just kind of flowed out of that kind of 1968 periodization, which always, people think of I think before historians like you came along to kind of give us something to chew on about what the 70s meant. Most of us were like, well, the 60s ended in 1968, and then people went into disco, and that was the 70s. and so I wondered if we could go back a little bit, because you kind of add so many layers, and disco does show up in your book, and I think it's framed really, really powerfully. But I wanted to know, like, kind of how you developed as a historian, because you study culture. At what point did like kind of studying culture become what you do as an historian?
Well, that's a really good question. It very much evolved over time. I certainly didn't get into history thinking of myself as a cultural historian or a historian of popular culture, whereas now I would say that sort of the central question of all of my work, from the 70s forward, is really about the relationship between popular culture and politics. And the ways those things shape each other and influence each other. And I think to some extent, that is a product of my coming of age as a 70s person, because I think one of the things that happens, sometime in that period from the end of the 60s through the beginning of the 80s, is I think it's fair to say that the growing discontent with politics and government, the growing cynicism about, I call them the men in suits. That is, all of the institutions, not only government, but doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers. I think that in some ways, more and more we see that people are turning to popular culture to form their identities, to form their most important affiliations. And so I think that to some extent, our politics and our popular culture are deeply intertwined. And that, even as I look further back in the past, has been kind of a central question for me. But I didn't come to that immediately. I think, I started off my career, in the early 1980s, I guess you would say, when I left college and went to graduate school. And when I got to graduate school, there were really two different bodies of historical scholarship, or two different approaches to the American past. there was this long-established body of political history, of traditional political history, the history of presidents and parties and elections and public policy. And then there was what was then called the new social history, that was already maybe a decade old, that was really interested in the lived experiences of ordinary people. And yet, even though there were now these two burgeoning literatures reflecting these two very distinctive and sometimes at odds approaches, nobody was putting those two kinds of history in dialogue. Nobody was asking, how do things like politics and policy affect the daily lives of ordinary people, and how then in turn do the actual day-to-day experiences of your average people shape and influence a political and policy-making process, thinking about ideologies on the grand scale. And so I wanted to, when I jumped into history, I wanted to try to figure out a way to make those two kinds of history talk to each other. So my first book, which was a study really of the remaking of the American South from the 1930s to 1980, was an attempt to do just that, to sort of ask that question of how does, government and politics affect the way people live their lives, and vice versa, how does lived experience shape a political or policy making process? And then as I, moved forward, it just became, so clear to the extent to which that culture, and especially popular culture, was becoming one of the most important arenas of conflict and contest in American life. And that especially as you moved into, the last half of the 20th century, I would say even the entire 20th century, that it was impossible to sort of understand how people constructed their lives and how they entered the public worlds of work and politics and schoolyard without understanding the way that popular culture operated.
Yeah, and that connection that you just drew about your first book, which is about the Sun Belt, right?
Right.
And for me, it makes sense because I needed a piece of information from that book in order to make a connection in my own work about GI coffee houses, which was about these military towns throughout the country. Specifically, I was studying Columbia, South Carolina, and I was wondering, why are these the people that live in this town so deeply connected to the American military, and why are their values like this, and why is their experience so patriotic in their culture? And then your book kind of explained a lot about the way that federal subsidies worked, and the way that the military was used as an instrument to build up these towns, and those connections were made in part from like a material perspective. It made their town. So either way, that kind of idea that the lived experience of people that you talk about being the hallmark of social history, connecting to the kind of great man model of history, the kind of studying the government and that kind of stuff, that really makes sense to me. That's a connection I hadn't really made before. Were you... when you were to go back, like before you became a historian, when you were young and coming of age in the 70s, how much were you like a part of 70s culture? How much was that stuff that you were? I guess what I'm saying is were you interested in American history as a young person? Were you already making those connections when you were watching, the Bronx is burning and all that stuff happened in the 70s, or was it something that connections you're making later?
Well, certainly by the time that was happening, I was already in college, and so I was somewhat aware, and I was studying history. I mean, I think that I didn't particularly have any kind of deep or insightful analysis of what was going on as I lived through it, though I certainly was curious, and I was asking questions. And so, for example, I grew up on Long Island, or at least I went to junior high school and high school on Long Island, about 50 miles outside of New York City. And, during the disco craze where I grew up, there was certainly a vibrant disco culture, but there was also this potent anti-disco movement. It was keynoted by the sort of semi-heavy metal band Twisted Sister, who later came to fame in the 1980s and sort of hit the national charts with songs like "We're Not Gonna Take It" and so on.
Yep.
But in the 1970s, Twisted Sister was famous only on Long Island, and they were famous because they were kind of the leaders of the local anti-disco movement.
Wow.
And at their shows, they would lead the audience in chants of "Disco sucks, disco sucks." And so I saw them a couple of times, and I found that very strange, even if I wasn't particularly a fan of disco. And sort of, I had to interrogate that. I had to ask where that was coming from and what that would mean. And certainly that was something that was in my mind later on as I began to try to think about my growing up as a historian.
What did that mean? I mean, if you were there watching, Twisted Sister lead these chants, reactionary chants against disco, I don't know. What did you? When I hear that, I feel like I'm reading like a lot of like homophobia in that, and a lot of kind of resentment of what disco might represent in terms of the kind of, I don't know, cosmopolitan, multiracial elements of it. Was that apparent to you at the time? Is that do you think that's what Twisted Sister was really calling to?
Yes, I mean, I think it was, and yet it was highly complicated at the time because at the same time, the Rocky Horror Picture Show was all the rage. There were midnight showings of it, at movie theaters all over the area. I mean, there still are the occasional midnight showings, but it has that sort of cult appeal. But Twisted Sister dressed up in drag,
right?
And they came on stage to the transvestite, transsexual song from the musical, from Rocky Horror. So it was figured in odd ways there when you think about it. And I don't know that the band itself sort of meant to tap into that message, but I think there was if not resentment, certainly an insecurity about the kinds of changes that were going on in American society, and that homophobia, anti-cosmopolitanism, a certain insecurity about how the largely white working class audiences, how they were navigating the social and economic changes of the 70s, and how, in some ways, I think there was some fear and insecurity about that. So I think you're absolutely right that that's what's going on.
These aren't my ideas. These are, a lot of this is from your stuff. I mean, what I love about the way you write about culture is that you kind of, I don't know, without doing it explicitly, you stand up for the idea of culture being a really, really important lens by which to understand what's going on. And, that's something I feel like in the historical discipline, especially as you move up in the academy through PhD programs, that's not really there's I've encountered a lot of skepticism about that kind of stuff. Did you have to overcome that in your work, the skepticism about using culture in this way and talking about it this way?
I mean, I think you're right that that's there. I certainly believe. I'm a little bit surprised, or maybe a little bit disappointed to hear you saying that even still today.
Right.
My sense is that that was just absolutely true 25 years ago when I was starting out, and that especially if you weren't writing about high art or high culture, it was very hard to justify the importance of those kinds of subjects. People understood. I mean, I think that, but then it seemed like, there's been a kind of gradual opening out of it. And I think, there were certain, in the historical profession and in the broader world, I think there were certain moments. So I think that, the work of some historians, I think Lawrence Levine would be a good example, helped to sort of give serious legitimation to the study of culture and even of popular culture, to think of it as he called it the folklore of industrial capitalism.
Right.
But I think also that there was kind of a generational change, and that, the generation that sort of grew up in a world in which the cultural realm had supplanted the political realm as the sort of major source of political and cultural dynamism, as the major sources from which people kind of drew on to form their personal identity and to place themselves in the world. But that, I think, kind of forced historians, even when they were looking back in time, to take it more seriously than they had before.
Yeah.
So while I'm sure that there still is a certain resistance to it, it seems to me that more and more people like you are taking on topics at which the cultural is front and center.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly that opportunity, especially in like with the development of American studies. I feel like you see that a lot more, and there's not a real question about it. I was kind of thinking more about history departments, but I think it varies. You know, it depends on which history department you're in, what you find.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, I think that it may be harder, especially in smaller history departments and in history departments in some regions of the country where they're only going to have, the one or two people doing all of U.S. history, that this seems like more of an add-on rather than something that is at the core of the historical enterprise. So I think you're right, that there is still some skepticism that somehow cultural history should be at the core of the historical enterprise. And yet, especially for the 20th century, it seems like, how can it not be?
Yeah. And I don't know, your song or your book on the 70s, I think you talk about the Jackson Browne song, Running on Empty. And I used it as as my final exam last summer. I played that song, and then I showed this clip. I don't know if you know that, but there's a clip when Forrest Gump is running in the 70s in the movie Forrest Gump, and he's doing that famous like stupid run across the country. They use that song, and it's kind of like a cheap. I don't know. It's like a cheap montage of a lot of the pop culture stuff that you discuss in your book. And so what I had them do is like watch the Forrest Gump clip and connect it to the ideas that are in your book. And that Jackson Browne song, the lyrics to the song are about kind of a generation that's lost. And it's so your reading of that kind of stuff. That's what I wanted to kind of bring up to, especially to my listeners, is that your reading of this of 70s culture is deep, and it goes to like some of the larger stuff that's going on. I wanted to ask you, how much were you a fan of that stuff when you were growing up, or were you coming of age? You said you're going to college by the time it's the late 70s, but were you a fan of this music, or what were you culturally doing in the 70s?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that. To some extent, every work of history is autobiographical, even if you're writing about some kind of very distant period and place. But I think when you write about the recent history of your own country, there's a kind of powerful autobiographical element to it, and a kind of wrestling with my own coming of age. But yes, I would say that my own experiences, and especially the music and movies, but to some extent also the television and comedy and novels that that I loved, really helped to shape my approach to the period, and they figure largely in that book. Now, I will admit that there were also some things that got that were left on the cutting room floor. And in part, that was because there were just some subjects that I felt were too close to me, and that I couldn't get enough distance from them. And so they had been sort of so central to my growing up and my own experience that I just, I felt that I couldn't, or maybe was unwilling to sort of take that step back and address them in the third person in the way that, I am able to talk about punk and disco and, a variety of different films and so on of the period.
So your interest in the 70s has continued because you have a book about the rise of the right in the 1970s and the rise of but that one's like an anthology of essays, right?
Right. Yeah. So that sort of gets back to the very first question that you asked.
Right.
Because, of course, if you were writing the 70s book today, it would be a very different book. Because when I set out to write the book, other than my own experiences, my own ideas as a historian, and the primary sources, there was very little to go on. Mm-hmm. Now there's been, almost an entire generation of historical scholarship about the 70s or various different aspects of the 70s. And so part of what I was trying to do in that anthology is to sort of capture a lot of that new historical scholarship and to sort of show the ways that it was, helping us to rethink this period and its significance.
And where were you in the politics of the 1970s? I mean, I know you were young and you're going, starting to go to undergrad years by the late 70s, but that I think of that period as the cliches of the period are of Carter and the malaise speech or the crisis of confidence speech and all of that stuff. Do you remember what you were thinking, and did you notice that? Because I think it's, like you just mentioned in your anthology and in other works of history, we're starting to, discover and unpack this kind of rightward lurch in our politics. Was it something that you felt at the time? Did you see that happening? Where were you on all of those issues? Because I think Carter is still a complicated figure, and it's not easy to kind of read those politics.
Oh, absolutely. In 1976, I was still living on Long Island. I actually was quite interested in politics then, and I volunteered for a local state assembly race, and it was I volunteered for the Democratic candidate for state assembly in a highly Republican district, so we had very little chance of winning. But it was also the same year that Daniel Patrick Moynihan was running against James Buckley for the Senate seat in New York State, and of course Carter was running against Ford for the presidential election. So we were, at the local headquarters, we were mostly involved in sort of planning events and making calls and signs for the local race, but we were kind of tapped into that, the national campaign that was going on at the time. And it was really interesting in that, the local headquarters where I was at was very much like New York City politics. It was kind of an outgrowth of New York City politics in that they were kind of traditional establishment Democrats. We might call them machine Democrats, very much like you would have found in New York City. And then there was this younger generation associated with a group called the NDC, the New Democratic Coalition, which was, people who had been influenced by the 60s New Left, if not participants in it, and wanted a more grassroots inclusive style of politics, were interested in different kinds of issues. But they were some of the, the sort of young managers of the campaign that, I was driving around with, and I could see some of those tensions. And of course, they were somewhat suspicious of Jimmy Carter. I mean, they were supportive of Jimmy Carter because, after 8 years of Nixon and Nixon's successor, they were anxious to, get a Democrat into the White House. But they were they were suspicious of Jimmy Carter. They were not very enthusiastic about him. And I think I certainly imbibed that at the time. And by 1980, I was like, by most Americans at that time, not enthusiastic about Carter's presidency.
It seems like there were a lot of people. I mean, you talk about New Democrats, but then when I think of New Democrats, I think of Reagan Democrats too. A lot of people jumped ship and voted for him in that election, right?
Yes, yeah, and especially in some of those same, Rust Belt working class locations that have been the feature of political discussion in recent times as well. But yeah, I mean, and of course in 1984, Reagan wins this sensational landslide over Walter Mondale, and even wins in Massachusetts, my new home state, which we think of as, the one place that went for George McGovern back against Nixon in 1972.
So why are the people like the NDC, the people that are, as you say, that were either participants or sympathetic to the New Left in the 60s, what's their problem with Carter? What are they suspecting about him? What kind of policy things do they not like about him? Is it economics? Is it foreign policy? Because I think of the New Left as such a broad thing, and it's splintering at this point, or completely fractured, and all those energies are going off into a lot of different places as you catalog in the 70s. But what did the NDC want? What did they not like about Carter, and what did you not like about Carter by the time you get to the Reagan election?
Well, I think there were three. I think that what they were suspicious of Carter for three different reasons. Some of it just had to do with his pedigree, and Jimmy Carter addressed this himself, as a white Southerner who had come late and tentatively to the open embrace of civil rights and the open condemnation of segregation. He was somewhat suspect. He was also somewhat suspect as a born again Christian. And so people were unsure about and kind of, wondered about who he was, especially since he didn't have much of a track record on the national stage. I think there was also some suspicion of him for matters of style, and that what we might call political style, and that he was basically a consensus-oriented, non-ideological. He billed himself as a pragmatic problem solver, someone who would bring in his engineering mindset to politics, who was not the captive of, but also not wedded to a particular ideology or set of principles. And I think for people who were ideologically motivated, like those NDC types, that was suspicious. And then, of course, he represented certainly the American politics have shifted greatly since the 1970s. At the time, he represented the most conservative wing of the Democratic Party, sort of the far opposite from those NDC types. And so his promising a balanced budget by the end of his first term was not something that they liked. His talk about trying to rein in the size of the federal bureaucracy and the complexity of regulations was also something that they understood as sort of code words for more market-oriented policies that they were suspicious of.
Yeah, with the way you're describing Carter there, and the way he engaged, I guess what would be called conservative language, particularly around economics, it sounds like Clinton to me. It sounds like that Clinton kind of took that model in some ways. I know we call it triangulation in the 90s, but it seems like a similar kind of impulse.
Yeah,
at least
years
politically,
back,
yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, years back, I wrote a piece for, I think it was the Los Angeles Times, it might have been the Washington Post, in which I basically described Carter as the first Clintonian New Democrat.
Yeah.
The difference was Carter couldn't get away with it. That Clinton was able to get away with it. That is, he was able to discipline the more liberal elements of his party. He was able to attack Jesse Jackson, to attack Sister Souljah,
That's right.
to attack identity politics, to pursue a more market-oriented approach and welcome business, because, at the time that he became president, the Democrats had been out of power for 12 years, and it seemed like, and they were desperate to get back into power, and so they accepted that kind of discipline. Whereas in 1976, Jimmy Carter was this guy who had come out of the blue, who didn't have much credibility, and now he was telling, senior members of Congress and other high officials in his party who had been through the struggles over civil rights and the Vietnam War, to do things differently. And Carter had much more trouble with his own party than he did with the opposition. It was really his failure to be able to discipline and lead his own party in Congress that undermined him in his first few years in office.
Mm.
And of course, he had to face a challenge from that establishment of his party from Ted Kennedy in 1980.
That's right. That's right. Wait, so remind me, did Kennedy primary him in 1980?
He did. Yes, he did. And they had a kind of, back and forth battle. Carter did finally defeat him in the primary.
Mm. So I think you kind of were understated a little bit earlier when you talked about how there were a lot of people who were skeptical about Carter, and you were one of those people. But when Reagan comes and Reagan, we know now, and I think probably by a certain point in maybe his first term or his second term, he would have been able to identify the contours of Reagan conservatism and what it really means. But did Reagan and those horrific kind of the coming of Reaganomics and those horrific years of the Reagan administration change your view of Carter? Did you feel less skeptical about him or more skeptical about him? Did you think he set up Reagan? How did that change your idea of the 70s, I guess?
Well, I'm a little bit of an outlier on that question. So I'm going to answer that question in two ways. And say, I think the conventional wisdom is because of what happened in the 1980s and also because of Jimmy Carter's impressive career as a post-president. I mean, to some extent, Carter invents the modern post-presidency since he's so young when he leaves office and has lived so long and been so active. And so Carter's post-presidency has made him, and the comparisons of him to some of his successors have made him look so good that you kind of think that, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, okay, somehow I heard some clicking and I thought I had lost you.
No, that's all right, I'm here.
That historians have wanted to take a revisionist take on Carter's presidency and to point out some of the successes of Carter's presidency.
Yeah.
And I would admit, I wanted that too. But when I began to look at Carter's presidency as a historian, one of the first things I did was a piece for a conference at the Carter Center in 1997, which was the 20th anniversary of his inauguration as president. And I did some research for it. I wrote an article. I presented it at that conference along with a bunch of other scholars. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter attended the conference.
Wow.
They answered the historian's question. So, kudos to them. I mean, you can't imagine Ronald Reagan or, George W. Bush doing that.
No.
You could probably imagine Bill Clinton doing it. And
Yep.
Nobody else getting it a word edgewise, but that's a different story.
Yeah, he's obsessed. Bill Clinton is obsessed with his legacy.
But I think that all of the historians who were essentially doing what was, we thought, the first archive-based reassessment of Carter's presidency, we really thought that that he was going to look better in hindsight, in the rearview mirror, in historical context, than we and all Americans had experienced his presidency. But as we looked into it, we found that wasn't the case. That over and over again, we saw, examples of mistakes and mismanagement. And I think, one clear example has to do with the handling of inflation, which was the crisis that really brought down his presidency.
Yeah.
And it becomes clear that early on in his presidency, he and his top advisors were aware of it. They understood what hadn't worked before, and yet they tried these things over and over again. And so, for instance, in the summer of 1978, Carter's communications guru, Jerry Rafshoon, the guy that Doonesbury cartoonist Gary Trudeau, created a character called the Secretary of Symbolism to make fun of.
Yep.
The guy behind the cardigan sweater and things like that. That Rafshoon writes Carter a memo in the summer of 1978 saying, look, inflation is the cancer on your presidency. People like you, They're inclined to support you, but if you can't do something about inflation, you're not going to win re-election. You're going to make it hard for people to support you because the value of their savings is eroding. They go to the supermarket and they can't buy meat anymore. They have to wait on long lines for gasoline and they can't afford the price of gasoline and heating fuel. And he says, you cannot err in the direction of too tough a program. You have to be as tough as possible on this. And that means you have to be willing to take on labor leaders who won't like it. You have to be willing to take on the business community who won't like it. And on the margin of that memo, he writes, Jerry, yes, let's do it. And, of course, he doesn't do it. Because then what follows are, months of internal negotiations and everything is kind of watered down, and they don't do it. And we see that over and over again. And in some ways, there was a kind of idealistic misreading of the American political process that undercut Carter's presidency, and the Malaise speech and how that was played would be a perfect example of that.
Well, I want to talk about that a little bit because I also showed that entire speech to my students last summer, the crisis of confidence speech, right? And they for them, they seemed to agree, and they thought there was something tragic about what he was saying about the American people needing to move beyond, a materialistic lifestyle and move beyond consumption as the main activity of life. And they thought all that was really great, but they also thought that that his tone was just way off, that he seemed overly self-righteous, or they just didn't like his tone, and they didn't like his kind of overall affect, I guess, if that makes sense. But that speech, what are we supposed to make of that speech? I mean, people always say that Carter tried to take the country in a different direction, but it was just a speech. It wasn't like a set of policies, really.
Yeah, it's the story you tell about your students is funny, and it's so right on.
Yes.
And what I have done for several years when I'm teaching that period is I actually assign the speech only as a paper text and ask them to read it before class. And then I ask them what they think of it. And in general, they're pretty positive about it. And they, in fact, think that his critique of consumerism and materialism is applicable to their own lives. And they like the speech. And then I show them the speech, and they are, again, appalled at the tone. They find it, preachy. They find it, and they find it insulting, and especially that passage where he repeats the word "things" over and over again, and he says it almost like it's a curse word. That having things and consuming things has replaced, and so I think that is something very striking about that speech. So, the speech was meant... And
indicates something about American politics, too, right? It's kind of like idea that, you can have the right ideas, but if you don't package them and present them in a way that connects with people, you're going nowhere.
Yes, and I think also that, to some extent, you can say that Carter misread the historical moment, which is his conclusions were reasonable, that the United States had entered an age of limits where we had to be much more modest about our role in the world, about our consumption of energy and other kinds of resources, about our relationship to the environment, about our economic expectations. But that was not a message that was going to prevail at that historical moment. And Ronald Reagan, who was the anti-Carter and offered a triumphalist notion of abundance, was able to defeat him easily.
Yeah, and Reagan comes in with a message that's so almost the opposite of what Carter is saying. He's saying, we're the United States, and we're, with the land of abundance, and more, and that kind of idea resonates more powerfully with Americans But I wonder what you think of this reading, because I've read this before, and I think that, a couple different historians, one by Andrew Basovich. I don't know if you know that name. He's written a lot about And
he was my colleague at BU until he retired 2 years ago.
Oh,
so
nice.
I know him very well.
So he has a reading of the Carter the Carter Doctrine, like backwards through that Malaise speech, where he basically says, the crisis of confidence speech was an attempt to alert Americans to this like big problem on the horizon, which was the American dependence on foreign oil and its relationship to countries in the Middle East. And the speech failed, and as a result, weeks or months later, I don't remember how long it was afterwards, Carter gives the State of the Union speech in January, in which he lays out the Carter Doctrine, which basically says the United States is going to achieve hegemony over the Middle East. Is that a reading that you, because yours is more kind of like your crisis of confidence speech reading is more about kind of his misfire on economic policy and things like that, but what do you make of that Carter Doctrine thing? Because it seems like an important moment.
Oh, well, it certainly is an important moment. I mean, I think that is what, I don't think that's wrong. I think that's a very broad reading of the crisis of confidence speech.
Yeah.
And of course, the crisis of confidence speech admits broad readings because it was so broad and so vague. So remember the context for it. It's the summer of 1979. You're in the midst of the second Arab oil shock, the OPEC oil shock, in which, oil supplies have been cut off, and so there's shortages and there are huge price spikes. And most states have rationed gasoline. In New York State, where I was living, there was odd even rationing, which means that if the last number of your license plate is an odd number, you can only buy gas on odd number days. Even number days if it's an even number. Many states had that. In lots of states, there were long lines at the pump. Sometimes you would have to wait hours or wouldn't be able to buy gasoline, and prices were spiking up. And so it was in the context of the energy crisis that Carter retreats to Camp David to prepare a speech on energy. He's going to give another speech on the energy crisis, which, of course, had been an important theme of his and an emphasis of his presidency, though his previous energy policies had not been all that successful. And yes, he wanted to try to transition the United States off its dependence on foreign oil, and to do that in a variety of ways. In fact, to transition Americans from the expectation of abundant, cheap energy into an era of conservation and scarcer, more expensive energy,
right?
Which he thought was coming. And that certainly has international repercussions, as Basovich points out, but it had a profound domestic, cultural, ideological repercussions as well. And so while he's at Camp David, he talks to everyone, not only mayors and governors and members of Congress, but religious leaders, labor union leaders, business leaders, leaders of various kinds of professional organizations. And he does a bunch of these helicopter drop-ins at the dinner table of ordinary Americans, within helicopter range of Camp David. And it's during that time there that he decides not to give a speech on the energy crisis, but on the spiritual energy crisis, on the broader crisis of confidence that he thinks underlays the energy crisis. So because he is so broad and so general, I think you can read that as leading into the Carter Doctrine or leading into various other, into policy areas having nothing to do with energy, but certainly energy and economy were the things that motivated him into giving that speech.
It's really weird because the crisis of confidence speech is almost like the message is almost "Make America Great Again," right? Like it almost seems to be like let's recover some sort of let's recover that good feeling we had before the 1960s came, and Reagan's just actually going to do that better than Carter.
Yes, but I think that the path that Carter lays out to making America great again is a very different path than the one that Reagan or Clinton or Obama or Trump have laid out.
So Have you thought about at all doing the same thing with that you did with the 1970s book with the 1980s, or do you encourage someone to take on that project?
Well, it's funny. I mean, already when I started to write the 70s book, even though there was no book like that about the 70s, there were already books about the 1980s, even though it was more recent in time.
That's amazing.
And I think that's because people had a sense of that they understood the 80s, that the narrative was clear, and there actually have been, there have been 3 books along the lines of my 70s book about the 1980s already, maybe even more than that, the 3 that I know of. I had thought about, I actually had at one point thought about doing a similar kind of book about the 1990s, or about the period that George W. Bush called years of sabbatical, the period between, 1989 and 9/11, 2001.
Wow, yeah.
But you know what? I think that just as I was the right person to write the 70s book, as a historian who was a 70s person, I think that I need to leave that to someone, I don't know, like you, or someone who was a 90s person to write that book.
I gotta go back and start watching my old G.I. Joe cartoons and everything. Did you? I was gonna ask you about the periodization, because you in a way you already did this. I mean, so people that haven't read your book on the 70s, I wanted to alert them to the fact that your periodization is kind of like this idea of the long 70s, and you kind of date the 70s. And my students always scratch their heads when I tell them this, and then I explain it, and then it makes sense. It's 1968 to 1984, so this like 16-year period you call the 70s. Why did you take it out of the 70s, and why does it stretch all the way from 68 to 84?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll admit feeling a little sheepish about that. Some people have said, "Hey, if you're gonna engage in decadism, which is kind of a dubious enterprise,
sure.
Then you ought to stick to 1970 to 1979. But as you know, as a historian, the idea of these long periods, the long 19th century or the long 1960s or something like that, is it's something that is in the vocabulary of historians trying to make sense of a period, because even though decades are nice units, they begin in years that end in 0 and end in years that end in 0, and they are just 10 years. They fit that sort of decimal comment that history doesn't work in 10-year increments. And even if you're trying to understand, for lack of a better term, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, I think you can't really expect that to be something that starts at, January 1st, 1960 or 1970,
right.
and ends exactly 10 years later. So to me, it seemed that, in the period between the turmoil of 1968, when when what we might say is the most utopian aspirations of the 1960s and the greatest turmoil of the 1960s came to a climax, and 1984, when the re-election of Ronald Reagan, but also the economic revival of the 80s and the 1984 Olympics, which was a kind of international celebration of a Reaganite vision of America, that to me, that sort of represented a discrete period with a before and after, and that we could understand the first few years of Reagan's presidency and the first few years of the 1980s as a kind of culmination of a set of trends that had been at work since the end of the 1960s, and then there was something new. So even though there was a little bit of cheating there,
it works, and it makes sense. And I think it demonstrates to me, like, I love periodization. I love to me that's one of the most fun things and the most kind of useful things that historians do, is kind of help make us make sense of chunks of time that way. And I think that 68 to 84 and that long 70s. I use your periodization all the time as an example just of how to do that, and how you can kind of take chunks of time and define them, the way you want to, and the way you're doing your analysis. So I think it works for me. I wanted to ask you about before we go. This show is called The Nostalgia Trap, and I feel like nostalgia is something that has probably has been operative somewhat in the way you write about history, and even in the sense that you have probably had I imagine having to avoid some of the traps of nostalgia when you're writing about things that you experienced firsthand, like particularly pop culture that you either liked or hated or had whatever attitude towards. But we're living through this time right now where nostalgia is here, and I feel like Make America Great Again is almost a nostalgic political movement in some ways. But there's like a Netflix show like Stranger Things is out, and there's this kind of like wave of 80s nostalgia and nostalgia for 80s culture. How much has nostalgia, is it a trap when you're a historian? Is it a trap to kind of like see the past through a distorted lens because of what you experienced through it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It is a trap, but it's a hard trap to avoid.
Yeah.
And I cannot claim to have always avoided it. Mm-hmm. And, my mentor, my graduate school advisor once said that separating the apparent from the real is one of the tasks of the historian, and that no more is that task urgent than with dealing with the recent history of the United States, because of the power of nostalgia, and because the professional nostalgists have control of the broadcast transmission, of the airwaves, of the commercials, of the TV shows, of the songs. And so, that kind of, dipped in nostalgia approach to the past that obscures more than it reveals is something that we all have to fight against. And yet when we're writing about, the history of the period which we live through, it's so hard to separate yourself from that. And I would say that probably the one thing that I've been most criticized for in the 70s book, and the only thing that protesters have put up signs when I've given talks about it, was my very harsh take on Peter Frampton. Well, Peter Frampton has a lot of fans.
That's amazing.
And certainly that was a case in which my own sort of personal taste, probably got a little bit out of hand in the writing of that book. That's
hilarious. But you know what? Peter Frampton, though, deserves it. I'm assuming I think I'm remembering you wrote about him as kind of like, I don't know, the way that people take Peter Frampton is that he was kind of the corporate version, the plastic version of something that was more authentic going on in rock and roll at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And, that he was that at least the Frampton of Frampton Comes Alive, which of course, was for a while the biggest selling album of all time and was a huge sensation. So that was a very consciously produced corporate product. It was sort of marks in some ways the ultimate example or high watermark of corporate rock, against which various other kinds of musical energies were opposed. But Peter Frampton, he's got his fans. I gave a talk once in which there were a whole group of people, holding signs about, pro Peter Frampton and against Schulman for that. So.
That's amazing. Wow. It's funny to think, of all the things you've written, it's the Frampton fans that take it out. You know what that gives me the context for? And this is the kind of stuff that I loved your book for, because I was born in 1978, so I didn't experience any of this stuff. But I experienced the kind of fallout of it in culture, if that makes sense. So everyone was talking about how much they hated disco, or there was always these things of hating Peter Frampton, or they show it in The Big Lebowski. Lebowski says, I hate the fucking Eagles. And I was like, why do hippies hate the Eagles? And I was like, isn't it the same? Is it the same thing? Maybe you can explain that. Is that Eagles are kind of the same thing as Frampton, right? They're kind of like a corporate version of the kind of counterculture rock that was popular in the 60s, and a more watered down version of that. Is that why people hate the Eagles?
Yeah, in both cases, of course, one of the reasons that people hate them is because of their phenomenal success. And,
there you go.
And so I think you're right. I think that is the essential critique of the Eagles. It strikes me that the Eagles were, they were actually pretty authentic to what the Eagles were. Not
Sure.
that I like them or think that you should like them. But certainly, there's not the evidence of the sort of the attempt to find someone that fit a certain image.
Right.
With the Eagles, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Bruce. I had a really great time. I think your work is like, again, I recommend it so heartily to listeners of this show because it was really formative for me in terms of history and what can be done with it. And it's really exciting to be able to make the kinds of connections that you make. So thank you for talking with me.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Bruce Schulman. It was great to finally talk with him. He's someone whose work I always have so much fun reading it, and there's so much humor to his analysis and so much depth to the history that he's telling. And I think as much as we talk about the nostalgia trap of writing about the era that you lived through, I think he successfully avoids a lot of those traps in his work and brings something out that's really, really incredible about the 1970s and an era that I think we're all starting to turn over more and more as historians and as Americans to kind of go back to this transitional moment that brought us in many ways to where we are today. So thanks, Bruce Schulman, and thanks to everyone who supports the show at Patreon. I'm having a great time with those bonus episodes. Lots more on the way. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.